In 1973, Herbert Marcuse responded to Max Horkheimer's admission that the once director of the Institute for Social Research was becoming, quote, old and stupid, as he said he was in a letter to his longtime collaborator. Marcuse wrote back to his friend Horkheimer. He said, "No, Max, we're not getting more and more stupid, but this world is terrible and is becoming ever more terrible beyond our capacity to imagine." This redirection of Horkheimer's pessimism about the human condition, especially in the West, from the individual to society, already confirmed that which Horkheimer knew. In the first half of the 1950s, Horkheimer referred to the condition facing humanity as being the totally dark world, a world wherein the inherent optimism that animated Hegel's dialectical philosophy could no longer be found, especially after the catastrophe of World War II and the Shoah. Likewise, Theodor Adorno, attempting or contemplating the destructive reality of negative dialectics, wherein the grandest of negativities gives birth to no discernible positives, as was the case with Auschwitz, explained that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, because to write the affirmative, the beautiful, the joyful amidst the barbaric only reifies, perpetuates, and camouflages the barbaric. For the first generation of critical theorists, especially in their late lives, the prognosis for the future of the West especially was bleak. Naive optimism about the human condition and the trajectory of the zeitgeist appeared pathologically irrational, a complete and utter denial of reality. Liberal optimism concerning the inherent progress of history seemed to collapse under the weight of history. By the mid-20th century, it was apparent to them that the Enlightenment had failed to realize its universal claims, but rather actualized the freedom of the few instead of the freedom of the many. Marxism, the Enlightenment's inner critique, morphed into authoritarian Stalinism. Substantive culture was either reified into mere commodities and or was wholly replaced by one-dimensionality of homo consumens. Religion was thoroughly neutralized or perversely turned into a feel-good ideology that sanctified capitalism. The individual was replaced by a man indistinguishable from the masses and highly susceptible to the skilled demagogue. The citoyen was replaced by the mass consumer. Humanism was replaced by technology and technocracy. The statesmen of peace, they were replaced by the industrialized capitalist warmongers. And philosophy had become nothing but consolation in the face of the meaninglessness, as Farid talked about, of modern despair, sharing the same fate as religion, especially Christianity. Seeing all this as the contemporary state of being and reading the trends, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse echoed more the metaphysical pessimism of Schopenhauer than the hopefulness of Kant, Hegel, and Marx, all of whom maintained not only the possibility of progress within history, but the assurance that it was in the process of becoming. It appears that the overwhelming tendencies within modern societies, especially in the capitalist world, were driving the planet into the abyss, and there was very little possibility to steer it into a rational and or more humanistic direction. These developments and many more contributed to the totally dark world that is becoming ever more terrible beyond our capacity to imagine. If we were to take a messianic view of the condition of humanity today, what would we see? Humans continue to build amazing architecture, buildings that surpass the wildest dreams of those who came before us. I just saw recently a news story about the deepest pool of water built in, I think it's maybe the United Arab Emirates or something, where people are snorkeling into what looks like an abandoned building, right? I mean, just amazing stuff that we're just continue to build. Humans continue to explore space by sending people into space, as well as long distance satellites, probes. Humans have built communication systems, clearly, like Zoom, Skype, and FaceTime, which allow us to connect with each other instantaneously from around the globe. The advancement of medicine has cured numerous diseases, healed the injured, has done miracles that only the sent by God could have previously done, such as restoring vision, hearing, the ability to walk, etc. When we look at these great accomplishments, which are accomplishments we can't deny to modern societies, we see that the advancement of instrumental rationality has continued unabated, unencumbered by the moral catastrophes of the present age, as Matthew talked a lot about. Rampant inequality, ecological collapse, the continual exploitation of labor, global sex trafficking, racism, neocolonialism, civil wars, xenophobia, and patriarchy, what Dr. Siebert talked about. It appears that when humanity is at its height in terms of its accomplishments via instrumental rationality, it has also perversely lost its grip on its moral compass. It is certainly the case that the ills of humanity have always been the ills of humanity, but at a time when many of those ills can be eliminated, we have chosen hyper-spectacle over solidarity. We have chosen technological phantasmagoria over human care. We have chosen the pleasure principle of forgetting and distraction, turning our backs on our current condition in order to avoid the pain and suffering caused by the reality principle, the facing up to the fact that as a species, we are killing off the very ecosystem that sustains our lives, our families, our societies, our species. An example of this, as Mehdi brought up, at the present moment are the billionaires, including Richard Branson, Bezos, and Elon Musk, as they compete for dominance in space tourism for the rich, wherein billions of dollars are being spent to entertain the wealthy, while back on planet Earth, aridification is happening in the US West. Europe is seeing record flooding, coastal buildings are collapsing, acidification of the seas are continuing, sea level rise continues, the ice caps are melting, the Siberian and North American tundra is melting, and just this morning I watched a news report about how they're having ravaging fires in northeastern Siberia, one of the coldest places on Earth. Heat waves in the Northern Hemisphere increase in frequency and severity. Massive droughts in the Middle East causing civil strife. Microplastics are causing mass die-offs of seabirds and other sea life, not to mention the catastrophe of COVID-19 global pandemic, which has killed millions of humans and has contributed to political destabilization in numerous countries. These joy rides to space are being lauded as the democratization of space, while the actual democracies on Earth are being undermined by misinformation, conspiracy theories, and authoritarian regimes. Humanity sees the billionaires and their new spaceships boldly going where only states have gone before and getting lost in the fantasy of someday, even for just a few minutes, escaping the reality of what we've done to this planet. The billionaires supply the daydreams, the masses get lost in it, and the reality of our self-destructive behavior remains undeterred. Necrophilia, the pathological embrace of that which is dead, has, to a certain degree, overcome much of humanity's biophilia, the love of that which is living. Biophilia as a way of being in the world seems to be atrophying under the weight of civilizational nihilism, as Farid talked about, the inability to engage in a course correction. The one-time member of the Institute for Social Research, Eric Fromm, argued in his 1976 book, To Have or to Be, that necrophilia as a state of being and as a comprehensive worldview was one of the most dangerous conditions that modern humanity embraced. It is a totalizing lifestyle and mindset that privileges ownership, control, and possessiveness over a being with solidarity and experiential ethic. This necrophilic worldview instills in the individual a sense of worth, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, an interpretation of reality, and an orientation of action, much like a religion. However, unlike the Abrahamic religions, which rest on a humanistic core, regardless of how distorted they can be, the necrophilic worldview detaches the necrophile from moral concern for the living. It renders the cries of the suffering mute. It systematically marginalizes their appeals for mercy. It renders them invisible among the fantasy opium that is mass produced and mass consumed in civil society. The night side of modernity, the ugliness that is caused by modern society, while ominously present for billions of people around the world, fades into the background for the elites as necrophilia takes shape in the latest mass distraction. Unfortunately, this bourgeois icy coldness trickles down into the masses who idolize the image of the billionaire, the necrophile, the sociopathic leader. His ability to see the suffering of others as himself, which is at the core of the biophilic way of being, as well as the core of communicative rationality, becomes standard for the aspiring necrophile who longs to shed the burden of caring for others. We see that quite clearly in the latest pandemic in the US. In this sense, the aspirant not only absorbs the ideology of the ruling masters, but also their psychology. They too detach themselves from the burdens of biophilia, the burden of solidarity, the burden of care, and embrace a pathological commitment to self-interest at the expense of all others. A self-interest that is, of course, in terms of ecological reality, irrational. While this may appear as a sign of hyper-individualization, it is not. It is a mass trend that creates uniformity, not diversity, a universalizing trend towards the uncaring society. Part of the dynamic that has driven us towards necrophilia as the dominant mode of being is the lack of a substantive alternative within modern, mostly capitalist societies. Religion, especially the case in the West, Christianity, as Adorno and others wrote in The Authoritarian Personality, has been thoroughly neutralized by modern scientific, rationalistic, and materialistic society. Adorno writes, the shell of Christian doctrine, above all its social authority and also a number of more or less isolated elements of its content, is preserved and consumed in a haphazard way as a cultural good, like patriotism or traditional art. The secular materialist zeitgeist did not allow for the substantive theological and moral claims to be taken seriously. All that could remain within a society rooted in the metaphysics of what is the case is a faint sense that religious values and doctrines are good, correct, and authoritative, but even those ought not to be taken too seriously and never put into praxis in any socially significant way. While individual morality could be informed by religious morality, social morality was increasingly informed by the needs of the market and its handmaiden, the state. Although many of the Frankfurt School's predecessors had a hand in promoting materialist conceptions of the world, Feuerbach, Marx, Freud, Lenin, and others, the collapse of meaning into meaninglessness of materialism, as Freud talked about, especially a form of materialism that could be functionalized by capitalism, was not adequately foreseen. It was the Antichrist, Nietzsche, of course, who foretold of the coming collapse of Western man into nihilism with the advent of modernity, a fate of meaninglessness that he too tried to escape with the apotheosis of the hero, the Übermensch. Nevertheless, between the ideology of the Übermensch and capitalist materialism laid the possibility of a worldview that took seriously the reality of material existence, which of course the Marxists have to do, while at the same time remain committed to materialism's original humanistic impulse. However, as secular materialistic societies became more and more capitalist societies, and the Übermensch migrated from the great men of arts and philosophy to the great industrialists and their sycophants and imitators, the resource of meaning in the Western world became increasingly drained. The life of the spirit atrophied. Religion, which didn't fully disappear as some of the left-wing and bourgeois materialists had hoped, rather became a mere consolation within the increasing meaningless society, perpetuated predominantly by the political and cultural right. According to Max Horkheimer, philosophy too shared the same fate. But unlike religion, philosophy, even critical theory, as he writes, could not point to a future escape hatch or utopia wherein the plague of meaninglessness would be mitigated or negated. Horkheimer writes that critical theory has replaced theology, but found no new heaven to which it might point, not even a heaven on earth. But it is true that it cannot rid itself of that idea, which is the reason people always ask it for the way that could take them there, as if it were not precisely the discovery of philosophy that heaven is none to which a way can be shown. As such, critical theory, just as the rest of philosophy, remains favete linguis, holding its tongue on the eschatological exit. Religion, on the other hand, especially in the West, either accommodated itself to capitalistic nihilism with a if you can't beat them, join them attitude, which produced the prosperity gospel, wherein the radical communistic Jesus of Nazareth was reconciled with the pathology of necrophilic accumulation, and this which consequently drained the gospels of their substantive social meaning. If the radical rabbi Jesus of Nazareth could be made to sanctify capitalist excess, greed, icy coldness, and territorial expansion, then Jesus of Nazareth became meaningless himself. However, when the dwindling numbers of Christians in the West remained true to the Sermon on the Mount, yet had the intellectual fortitude and honesty to see the reality of the post-Christian condition of secular capitalist modernity, Christianity became mere eschatological consolation, as Horkheimer pointed out, an opium to temporarily escape the pains of the totally dark world. Consolation Christianity is hardly even the shadow of the civilizational force that it once was. What's more, while the shell of Christianity remains appropriated for political purposes, its essence is all but evaporated, except among a few secular saints who have been able to translate its moral and ethical truths into secular language. And the last thing to be said, it is clear that in the West, we have advanced technologically beyond what much of our ancestors could have ever dreamed. Yet, what is the price? What have we done to the earth to accomplish such miracles? What have we done to other peoples and civilizations to accomplish such leaps and bounds? Without falling into the antinomy of ethnomasochism, which is not helpful at all for any future causes, we in the West have to take a painful look at the state of our societies. While those societies are wealthy, they are predicated on poverty, both inner and external poverty. While they are technologically advanced, their families are falling apart. While they are democratic, democracy is undermined by spiritual despair and the increased pathologization and irrationalization of the life world. While they are scientifically advancing into areas of the cosmos never seen before by the human eye, they are losing sight of their neighbors next to them on earth. We've paid a high price for our secular modernity. We think that maybe we've done too much. Thank you.